Hi, the Mudbrooker here. Today I have a wonderful recipe for you. I'm going to make a spicy chocolate bread pudding with bourbon sauce. And not only that, I'm going to take the long way around doing it, show you how to make some really good bread for it, what to do with your bread, and finally how to make the bread pudding. But first, I'm going to start off by thanking my channel members, The Needy Homesteader, Grampy Lobster, Mr. Smith's Kitchen, S.W. Heatley 27, Ron Thompson, Loretta Comer, Billy Lee Lawhan, Karen Neal, Richard from Canada, Mel Good, Me and You Acres, Rachel Tremblay, Beagle Mama, Greg Boone, Morwenna Thieker, Linda Jasper, Linda Neff, Fred Revels, Judy James, and my two newest members, Pat Hirsch and Mike Newby. Your support is greatly appreciated, and if you care to join my channel, I'd appreciate that as well. And in your honor, seeing as how I already have the bourbon out, I'm going to have a little bourbon. Here's to you guys, and thank you much. Making bread from scratch is a very simple process, and if you have a good stand mixer, it's very easy. It's a skill everybody should learn, and there's not really too much difficulty to a good basic white sandwich bread. You start off with sugar and yeast. I always proof my yeast. Proofing is either allowing the bread to rise, or in this case, it's allowing the yeast to become active before you mix in the rest of your ingredients. So what you need is a tablespoon of sugar, which is coming out very slowly, a tablespoon of sugar, and 2 teaspoons of yeast. Now there's a few different kinds of yeast. Basically there's regular dry active yeast, there's instant yeast, and there's bread machine yeasts. The main difference between them is how much heat they can withstand. For regular active dry yeast, you want the water you add to it to be about 100 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of your instant yeasts you can go up to about 115 or 120, and the bread machine yeasts, they can stand a lot more. They can go up to almost 130 degrees before you start running into problems killing your yeast. Now, with a little practice you can tell pretty much by touch whether your water is the right temperature, but it's still always a good idea to actually check the temperature before you add it to your yeast. And this is cooled off a little bit, but it's still 104 degrees, which is right in the good range. You can use instant and bread machine yeast at lower temperatures, so generally make sure your water is about 100-105 degrees and you'll be good. I'm going to add a cup and a half of water for this recipe. There's a half a cup. 1 1.5. Give it a little stir to dissolve the sugar and get the yeast mixed in and dissolved a bit. And then I'm going to let this stand for 5 minutes until my yeast starts getting foamy and starts working. So 5 minutes, we'll be back and we'll take the next step. My yeast has been proofing for 5 minutes, and as you can see, there's a nice layer of foam on top of that. The reason I always proof my yeast is because yeast can go bad. Eventually it will just plain won't work. If you keep it in the refrigerator, it lasts quite a long time. If you want to store it even longer period of time, put it in the freezer. But like I said, I always proof it first to make sure it's going to work, and it gives the yeast a good head start and it helps your bread rise better. So I'll lock this down, and now we're ready for my dry ingredients. I have 4 cups of bread flour. You can use all-purpose flour for making bread, works just fine, but I prefer bread flour because it gives it a bit more body. There's more gluten in bread flour than there is in all-purpose flour, and that's what gives it, a better, a fluffier crumb. It holds the carbon dioxide from the yeast better. Anyway, the yeast is ready. 4 cups of bread flour. I'm going to add 2 tablespoons kind of heaping tablespoons of powdered buttermilk. Putting some sort of dairy in your bread gives it a lot better flavor, gives it real good body. You can use 1.5 cups of warm milk instead of water in this. I use water and powdered buttermilk. And you also want about 1.5 teaspoons or so of salt. You want to add the salt to your dry ingredients rather than adding it to your yeast and sugar, because salt will inhibit yeast growth. It doesn't make a big difference when it's mixed in the dough, but if you add the salt to the water and sugar that you're trying to get your yeast started in, it'll slow the yeast down. So just dump in your dry ingredients. Add the last ingredient, which is 2 tablespoons of softened butter. You just go ahead and drop in a chunk of softened butter. Get that in there. Now I'll put the dough hook on my mixer and mix this. For kneading bread, you don't want to go higher than 2 on a KitchenAid stand mixer like this. I usually do it all on setting number 1. You want it fairly slow. I'll lock that down, start it off. I'm going to mix this for a couple of minutes until it comes together as a ball, and I'll show you something important to know then. Okay, this kneaded for 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. The exact time isn't important. All we're trying to do is get the yeast to come together into a ball like this. And the way you can tell if you have the right amount of water in your bread is once it comes together as a ball, you can see that it's pretty much cleaned off the inside of the bowl. There'll be a little sticking there at first until everything mixes together, and then it'll pull off anything stuck to the sides. A few little smears is okay, but if you got a lot of dough stuck to the sides, you're going to want to sprinkle in another tablespoon or 2 of flour and watch it and see if it cleans out. Flour will absorb moisture from the air if it's humid out, and it'll dry out if it's, very dry, low humidity where you're at. So sometimes you have to adjust this a little bit, but it usually works out just right with 1.5 cups of liquid and 4 cups of flour. Anyway, now that this is together as a ball and I can tell that's got the right amount of liquid, I'm going to turn my mixer back on and let it knead for 5 or 6 minutes. And we'll be back when 5 or 6 minutes are up. Alright, it's been 5 minutes, and this is kneaded out pretty good. Kind of broke in half right there at the very last, but if it comes into 2 pieces, don't worry about it. Another way that you can tell that your bread has the right moisture is if it comes off the dough hook nice and clean. And I'll show you here, take this off. And you can see the inside of the bowl is nice and clean. Now this little practice, you can tell by the feel of the dough, this feels just a little bit moist, so it might take a couple more minutes in the oven, but it's well shaped, it's good to go. I don't usually knead my bread very much. I just kind of shape it into a ball when it's done mixing. Just kind of turn it inside out and pinch it back together on the bottom, and just kind of roll it around a few times. Make a nice ball out of it. Get the bottom all squeezed together good. What I'm going to do now is lightly grease the inside of my bowl with a little bit of butter. You can use oil for this too. You just want a light coat of oil or butter on the inside of your mixing bowl so the bread doesn't stick to it. And then I'm going to let it rise. Let me get some more in here. Just like proofing the yeast, this is proofing the dough. Throw that in. Let me wipe my fingers off quick. And then I usually just flop it around in the bowl a few times. Kind of roll it around, flip it over, roll it around. Do that a few times, and that'll coat the outside with a little butter, and it'll smear it around nice and evenly inside. Take some plastic wrap, cover it up, and let this sit until it at least doubles in size. Should take about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how warm it is in the room you're in. And that's that. I'll be back once this is risen, and we'll move on to the next part. My bread is risen nicely. That's more than doubled in size. Set my plastic aside because I'll need that. And now it's ready to punch this down. You just press it down good. And I have a greased bread pan right here. That's a nice little Pyrex bread pan. I like Pyrex for baking bread. They work really nice, but a cast iron Dutch oven works great. Cast iron skillets. You can even do this on a pizza stone. If you just make it into a round ball, sprinkle the pizza stone lightly with some cornmeal so it doesn't stick, and bake it up that way. But I'm going to do a regular loaf with this in a Pyrex loaf pan. All you got to do is just kind of mush it around a little bit until you have a more or less loaf-shaped piece. Pinch the bottom nice so it's stuck together good. And stretch her out just a little bit more. And lay it in your loaf pan. Once you got it in the pan, kind of pat and stretch it a little bit to get her all the way out to the ends. Pat it down nice and flat. And I'm going to want to cover this and let it rise again. It doesn't have to double in size again, but you do want it to rise till it's a little bit over the top of the bread pan. And that'll take about 20-25 minutes, depending on how warm it is. I also usually take the plastic and I'll wipe it on the inside of my mixing bowl just to get a little smear of butter on it to help keep it from sticking to the top of the loaf. Just cover that up loosely. You can use a damp tea towel to do this. That works good too. And we'll let this sit and rise again before we put it in the oven. My dough is risen for the second time. Peel the plastic off of there. And as you can see, it's a little bit higher than the top of the pan. Like I said, you don't need to let it completely double because this will rise quite a bit in the oven. As the warmth gets through there, the yeast will become more active until it gets too hot and gets killed off. And the carbon dioxide bubbles will expand a lot from the heat. So this will rise up quite a bit in the oven yet. They call that oven spring. So I'm going to throw this in the oven. I have it preheated to 350 degrees. And it is going to take about 45 minutes, probably closer to 50, because like I said, this was a little bit dampish. And I'll show you how to tell if it's done when it's done. I just pulled my bread out of the oven, and as you can see, it has risen to quite a bit more. It should just lift right out of the pan. This is still pretty hot, but it should just lift right out of the pan. If it does stick a little bit, just leave it sitting in the pan for 10 minutes or so. As it cools, the bread will shrink a little bit because it cools off a bit and it lets some of the built up steam and gas bubbles escape, and it'll shrink a little bit and it should pull away from the sides pretty good and then try and lift it out of the pan. But this didn't stick, so it's not a problem. The way you tell if your bread is done, it's got a nice brown to the crust, but mostly it's because it sounds quite hollow when you tap on it. Still a little bit warm. I'm going to let this cool off. I usually let it cool on a rack so we can get a little bit of air circulating underneath. If you just set it right on the counter, it can get a little bit soft on the bottom because it's still pretty hot and steamy in there. But I let it cool on the rack for a few minutes just to keep it from getting soggy on the bottom. Anyway, I'll let this cool a bit, come back, and we can finally get started on the bread pudding. My bread has cooled down a fair bit. Still a bit warm, but that's okay. Now we're going to start cutting up some bread for the bread pudding. Most people think that you can just leave a few slices of bread out on the counter for a day or so and let them dry out and get stale and make bread pudding out of them. But for really good bread pudding, you want to dry the bread in the oven. You want it completely dry. That way it soaks up everything real good and you get a lot better results. I'm going to need about 3 cups of dried bread cubes. I have some left over from making my test batches, so I'm not going to have to make a whole lot, probably about 2 slices worth. You know, they're fairly thick slices, but a couple of slices worth should be enough for what I need. set that aside. And I'll cut these into cubes. If you're using just regular store-bought bread for this, probably 3, maybe 4 slices is enough. But like I said, I have some cubes left over. I have my oven preheated to 350 degrees, or not 350, 300 degrees. I'm going to put these in that baking dish. They're fighting me a little bit, they don't want to stay piled. Put these in the baking dish. Get them spread out nice and broke up. And I'll put these in the oven at 300 degrees until they're nice and dry. Along the way, I will toss them around, stir them up a bit, and they'll brown a little bit. You don't want to really toast them, but if they brown a bit, that's fine. I just want these nice and dried out and good and crispy. So these will go in the oven, 300 degrees, for however long it takes. It's hard to say. My bread cubes are finally dried. Like I said, I had some left over from before. Took about 45 minutes. How long exactly it'll take depends on how big they are, how moist your bread is. So you just got to kind of watch them, flip them over, toss them around a bit as you go. But we're finally ready to start putting together the actual chocolate bread pudding. Let me tip the camera down a little bit here so you can see what I'm doing. First thing you'll need is 3 cups of your bread cubes. I don't have quite 3 cups here, so I got to grab some of these. Now if you have cubes left over, just put them in a plastic bag and save them. You can use them for croutons. You can season them up and use them for whatever you would use dried bread cubes for. There's about 3 cups. I got 3 cups of these. Pour them into a oven-safe baking dish. Set that aside. We'll set this aside for right now. And now you're going to make the pudding part of the bread pudding. Get these flattened out. You want 2 tablespoons of cocoa. Just straight unsweetened cocoa. I'm not sure if I have quite that much in this can or not. There's 1. There's 2. And a half a cup of sugar. It helps to dissolve the cocoa a little bit better if you mix it with the sugar first. Just kind of stir it around and it'll dissolve a bit better later on. So we'll mix this up lightly. Doesn't have to be real well mixed, but mix them up a little bit. And now we want, where did I put them? 5 eggs. Let me grab my eggs. Most recipes like this call for 4 eggs, but I find that 5 eggs seems to work a little bit better. You get a bit more pudding to it instead of having it really bready. Oops, there's 1. 2, 3, 2 more. 4 and 5. Now for the spices, you want this fairly strong spicy. So you want about 1.5 teaspoons of nutmeg. There's a big heaping teaspoon, that's close to 1.5 teaspoons. Nutmeg, ground ginger, get off there, you. Give her a little bit more. And ground cinnamon. Like I said, a big heaping teaspoon is good. 1.5 teaspoons is what you're kind of looking for. The cinnamon and the ginger give it a little bit of heat to it, a little bit of a spicy bite. And the nutmeg gives it that nice aromatic sweet flavor. Now, let me get some of this other stuff out of the way. Too many things in one spot. I'm also going to add about a teaspoon or so of vanilla. This is nice homemade bourbon vanilla. And we'll give that a little shot of that. And you'll be seeing this again later. Now, mix this up good. You want to beat your eggs a little bit, and you want to get all of that cocoa dissolved. It takes a bit of doing to get it all stirred in, but it'll get in there eventually. Break up the egg yolks. Get the sugar started to dissolve. And we're going to add some milk to this, but it's a lot easier if you get that cocoa stirred in and dissolved good with a whisk before you try adding the milk. Otherwise, it's really tough to get that cocoa dissolved sometimes. Okay, I think we can add the milk now. You want 2 cups of milk. There's 1 cup. And 2. Get everything stirred together good, get everything dissolved and incorporated. Make sure everything's scraped down off of the sides. Kind of nice using a glass bowl, you can see if there's anything stuck to the side. And then go ahead and pour this over your bread cubes. I'm going to leave this sit for about 5 minutes or so. Give it a little bit of time to soak up. Your bread cubes will still be a bit floaty, but once this is sat for 5 minutes, I'm going to put it in the oven at 325 degrees. It'll take about 35 to 40 minutes to bake through, or until, if you stick a knife in the center, it comes out clean. And I'll show you that when we get to that point. But I will throw that in the oven in a few minutes, and then we'll get on with making the bourbon sauce. My bread pudding is in the oven. It's about half done. So now I'm going to make the bourbon sauce. This is easiest to make in a double boiler. You can do it over a low heat in a small pan, but you're using an egg yolk in there, and it's real easy to scorch it. The egg wants to fry if you're not careful. So, like I said, it's easiest to do it in a double boiler. You start off with a 1/4 cup of butter, which is a half a stick, and we get that melted. While that's melting, I'm going to beat 1 egg yolk. Beat that lightly. Doesn't have to be terribly well beaten, just enough to get it a little more yellow than it already is. Got the 1 egg yolk, 2 tablespoons of water. I'll just put that right in the egg yolk. Beat that a little bit more. And I'm going to put a little splash of my vanilla in there. About a half a teaspoon's enough. Stir that around. And the butter is just about all melted. And as soon as that's all melted, add 1/2 cup of sugar. Stir that around, get it dissolving good. Turn my heat down a little bit on the double boiler. And then you add your egg yolks, well, the egg yolk and water. And you just stir that in. And we're going to heat this. It doesn't have to quite boil. You can bring it to a boil if you want. It won't hurt anything. The main thing is to get everything dissolved, get all the sugar dissolved, and get it incorporated really good. So I'm going to heat this up until it's just about boiling. That'll take a few minutes. So once I'm done boiling and stirring this, I'll start talking to you again. Oh, and you want to stir this continuously. This isn't quite boiling, but it isn't very far from it. So let me check here quick. Yeah, that's plenty warm. Now that we've got it to where it's just about boiling, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of bourbon. We'll stir that in. Let it cook a little bit more so that it heats back up and drives off most of the alcohol. It only took about 7 or 8 minutes to get this cooked through and heated up good. And with the bourbon, you just need to keep cooking and stirring for maybe another minute or 2. So this is just about done. And I'll go ahead and take this off the heat, but I'll leave it right in the double boiler. And I'll keep stirring it until it quits boiling. Once the water quits boiling, it's done, and I'll just cover it up and leave it sit until my bread pudding is done. But I'll leave it in that warm water so it stays nice and warm. Alright, it's quit boiling, so I should be able to leave it alone now. Give her a little taste. Oh yeah, that is really good. You gotta try this stuff. And my bread pudding should be done in about 4 or 5 minutes. We'll check that out and keep on going. As I mentioned before, oh, that smells good. You can really smell that spice. As I mentioned before, the way to check to see if your bread pudding is done is take a knife, insert it in the middle, and that is nowhere near done. That's going to take a bit longer, I guess. So, I'll be back once this is actually finished. There is a reason this wasn't done the first time I checked it. It's because this is a full batch. Yeah, that's pretty clean, so that's done. Normally it takes about, well actually this took about 50 minutes. I had made several half batch, test batch tweaking my recipe, and those only took 35. So when I said it's 35 minutes, it's closer to 50 for a full batch. I'm going to take this out, let it cool down for a few minutes, and then give her a taste. Alright, this has cooled off a little bit. Had a little time to set up. I got my bourbon sauce handy, and let's give her a taste. Dig some up here. Kind of crispied up on top. Get a little bit of that good stuff off at the bottom. The first bit out always looks kind of bad, but you can see it's, oh, that's nice. Knocked over my oil bottle and broke it. Anyway, looks nice and good. We'll give her a little of that bourbon sauce. Stir that up. It's still nice and warm. Spoon some of that over there. And we'll give it a taste. That is so good. The spiciness and the chocolate really go great together. You know, chocolate, cocoa tastes really good with a little cinnamon, a little spicy heat to it, and that bourbon sauce is so sweet and rich. It just goes together fantastically. So, like I said, this is a fairly simple recipe. It's easy to make even if you don't go the long way around and make fresh bread right from scratch. The bourbon sauce is great. You gotta try that for some kind of dessert thing. And that's how you make spicy chocolate bread pudding. I'll see you guys next time. Have yourselves a Merry Christmas.